And they're hilarious too, especially from the 19th century, like around the time of the Civil War. A lot of people were like rum runners. Lighthouse keepers are like facilitating the illegal booze
Mm.
trade. And again, during the Prohibition years, it's hilarious.
Hi, I'm Ayla Sparks, and this is Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers. From ancient relics to modern marvels, each episode of the show features a new museum and a curator's choice of some amazing artifacts housed there. These guardians of history will share insights, anecdotes, and the often untold stories that breathe life into the artifacts they protect. Thanks for tuning in to this Mighty Oak Media production, and enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Curator's Choice. Today on the show, the amazing history of my favorite navigational aid, the Drum Point Lighthouse. Our guest, Kevin Allor, senior interpreter at the Calvert Marine Museum in Solomons, Maryland, takes us on a journey through treacherous waters, conservation eras, resourceful lightkeepers, and traveling libraries in this episode that transcends time and tides. We will be exploring the unique screw pile design that anchors the lighthouse into the Chesapeake Bay and the daily lives of the lighthouse keepers that serviced them. Delve into the fascinating traveling libraries that brought a variety of books to the isolated lighthouse keepers and their families, and the life saving light that shines from Fresnel lenses atop this cottage style lighthouse. From weather extremes to raising beagles above the water, this episode will give you a glimpse of the trials, tribulations, and incredible self sufficiency of those who kept the lights. So, without further ado, let's jump right in with Kevin.
So the Drum Point Lighthouse was a navigational aid that guided in steamboats to the Solomons steamboat landing from 1883, and then it continued to run until 1962, even though by that point the age of steamships was already ended. It sat at Drum Point unattended and just deteriorating from neglect and vandalism until 1975, where we moved it to the museum to restore it. So this was one of those things that happened in the 1970s. There was a rush of different institutions trying to save what are now considered National Historic Landmarks, but really weren't before that. So this includes Mount Vernon. It includes so many different historic homes. It was sort of a decade of preservation. And that was our goal, was to take this really important piece of maritime history and preserve it.
So, for this lighthouse, what is the process of moving an entire lighthouse? And it was intact, they didn't take it apart, right?
So it was it was fortuitous because during the 1970s, so where we positioned in southern Maryland, Solomon's Island is on one side of the Patuxent River, and then we have a major naval air station on the other side of the river. It had already been built. People from both sides of the river were working there, but they were traveling by boat. There was no bridge connecting the two counties. So they were building the bridge. And so the company that was doing that, BF Diamond, which I think was out of Georgia, they already had all of the equipment necessary to move something like the screw pile lighthouse. So because it was a big contract for them, and we were already paying a lot of money to have them here, and supposedly there were also maybe some things that happened, and this was offered as a way to get them some good press. They just took a day, brought some barges up to the lighthouse and some cranes, cut the lighthouse off at the water line, leaving the screws in Drum Point, set the lighthouse on a barge, and then just floated it up the river and then into Back Creek, which is where the museum abuts to, and put it in. It's really cool when you see older photographs from my childhood of the lighthouse, because we hadn't created our boat bays in here. So it was just a lighthouse sitting in the middle of a field.
That's so out of place.
Yes. Yes.
You did have to restore it because it was in some pretty rough shape.
Yeah. So none of the windows or doors were in place. There were big holes in the roof and floors. And it had been through, from 1962 to 1975, all of those summers of teenagers looking for something to do on a lazy summer day. What do? They climbed up the lighthouse, bonfires. There was evidence of that. There were beer cans everywhere. Their initials are carved all over the lantern room of the lighthouse.
Which you can still see today when you go up there.
Oh, yeah.
And what's cool about the Drum Point Lighthouse is it is a particularly unique style of lighthouse.
So it's a screw pile lighthouse. At first, in the Chesapeake Bay, like most other regions, we would build towers. But the Chesapeake Bay has some geological issues, I guess you'd say. The bay itself is flooded by the Atlantic Ocean, and so as the sea level rises, the Chesapeake Bay continues to grow even now, and the land is subsiding at the same time. So we have this underwater landscape that is different from other areas. We needed to put our lighthouses in the water because the obstacles were not, near rocky shorelines. They were 300, 400 yards offshore. So the screw pile design anchors in to whatever the base is. So in the Chesapeake Bay, it's mucky, soft silt. The screws anchor down, and then there's a system of cross rigging above that, above water, where it can be tightened and keep everything level. So it was a very economical way to tackle this problem of putting lighthouses in the water. There were 42 of them at one point in time. And today, only 4 have survived. And there's a good reason for that, too, because while this is an economical design, it doesn't mean it was going to stand up to everything. And in the 19th century, after the Civil War, so from, let's say, the 1860s up through the 1890s, there were a series of brutally cold winters. And the ice buildup on the Chesapeake Bay actually destroyed countless screw pile lighthouses.
And if you think about it by its own nature, I mean, it's in the water, and anything that's going to be in brackish or salty water is just going to erode much quicker, anyways.
Yes.
But it was particularly so during those icy periods because the ice would literally shear them off the screw pile foundations, which is just crazy. And I remember hearing about one in particular where the lighthouse was sheared off and it floated downriver for like 4 or 5 miles on an ice sheet.
With the keeper on it.
Oh, I didn't know the keeper was on it. Wow.
Yes.
So the screw pile lighthouses, they were very popular in the Chesapeake Bay. And currently, today, the Chesapeake Bay doesn't really freeze over anymore, but it's just insane to picture this poor lighthouse keeper floating on the ice, and there was no rescue. There was no one coming to save you.
It happened numerous times. Several lighthouse keepers perished when this happened. Overexposure to the elements. And, this is before OSHA. Like, there was no regulatory agency making sure workers were protected. A lot of lighthouse keepers didn't have the best experience.
But I mean, now it's nice. It's got a nice dock around it. There's a boat basin, and it's surrounded by water. And it's about as high as it would have been out of the water when it was actually in Drum Point, right?
Yeah, Chesapeake Bay lighthouses. So it's not just the screw pile design. It's also the fact that the bay is very long. I think if you were to unravel all the tributaries in the Chesapeake Bay, it's longer than the West Coast, but it's not very wide. So most points are only 6 or 7 miles wide. So they're short lighthouses. They didn't need to be tall like the coastal lighthouses. It's only 30, 40 feet above water.
And you'd only need to see the light a few miles away, right? Like never more than the widest point, I think, of the Chesapeake Bay is 7 miles or something like that. But even with a short distance, you still needed to have a light source at the top of the lighthouse.
So Fresnel lenses were just a part of lighthouses by the time Drum Point was built in 1883. And it had a couple that it used. The characteristic of a light, could be flashing in a pattern. It could be a color pattern. And Drum Point did change. So the current lens up there, it's a 4th order Fresnel lens. They come in 7 orders. And a 4th order or a 5th order lens is what we have in most of the Chesapeake Bay. They're really for rivers. And since the Chesapeake Bay is basically a giant river, they work. This one was put in 1911. And part of the lens, it's missing. It's 3/4 of it because a part of it faced the shore. And then the parts of the lens that angled out into the river and the bay had red panels installed to mark out all of the shoals that had built up. And there we have a navigational chart under the lighthouse just to show people how insane it was. If you're looking at the river from the shoreline, right next to the northern shore coming out of Solomon's, the depth of the water is 9 feet right next to the shore, and then 20 feet just off of it. But then about 200 yards off, it gets 2 feet deep. So if you're a sailboat, you're going to ram right into that 2 feet of water. So these panels, these red panels, helped really simplify navigation because the captain just needed to look at the lighthouse, and if the light was red, they're going to look at their chart and they're going to continue a course to the center of the river. And then as soon as the light turned white, that was their clear shot out of the river and into the bay, or vice versa.
And they also had a cartographer that would come out every so often because, I mean, you're talking about the shifting sands on the bottom of a very active river. So it would change, even if you had it memorized.
And there were, they weren't calling them hurricanes at that time, but there were. I mean, every summer there were these big storms and they would shift everything around. So I think don't quote me on this one, Bay Hydrographer, I think is what it was, the group that would come and just map everything out.
And also because of that, when the lighthouse was first installed, it was quite a ways offshore, but by the time the museum had moved it, it was almost on land.
Yes, it had all built up over time. So originally it was in maybe 7 to 10 feet of water. And by the time they moved it, it was completely out of water at low tide. So people today, as they sail by at Drum Point, if you're going by at low tide, you can see the pilings just sticking right out, which is really cool.
And being screw pile lighthouses, they have gigantic iron screws at the bottom of each of those pilings, and they were basically augured down into the sand. And I think they were done by a company in Baltimore. They were like prefab lighthouses, right?
Yeah, so there were actually 3 different organizations that ran lighthouses over the course of Drum Point's history. So when they built it in 1883, it was the Lighthouse Board that was running lighthouses. And out of Baltimore, there's a place called Lazaretto Point, and most lighthouses were fabricated there. So it's using Baltimore ironworks for the metal, and then local timber. And Drum Point is really interesting. There's another lighthouse in the bay called Hooper Strait Lighthouse, and that lighthouse is the same as Drum Point. They were prefabricated. So at Lazaretto Point, they had all the ironworks done, but then they built the house that would go on top of the frame, and then just knocked it down in big pieces, sent it down to Drum Point, built a platform so they could screw in the pilings. And then once that was built, everything went up very quickly because of that.
Yeah, it was like a crazy record time from when they started. It was like 30 days from when they started until they lit the light for the first time. So, the lighthouse, you said the first group of people who were kind of managing lighthouses, this was back before there was really a countrywide organization that was specifically running lighthouses.
So there was the U.S. Lighthouse Establishment. So that was started back at the very end of the 1700s, right after the Revolutionary War. And then I think in the 1850s, it went to the Lighthouse Board. And these were both parts of the Treasury Department. And then again, in 1910, they did a shift and it became the U.S. Lighthouse Society, or U.S. Lighthouse Service. Sometimes it's called the Bureau of Lighthouses. And that was a shift, basically. Before that, it was sort of quasi-military. So the board was full of like a mixture of business people and like admirals, things like that. And a lot of the people serving on lighthouses were former soldiers. In 1910, it was a shift to more civilian. And some really important things happened then, like creating a retirement program for lighthouse keepers. And then again, there was a switch in 1939. The U.S. Lighthouse Service dissolved and everything came under the United States Coast Guard.
And along with these different changes between different organizations who were running it, it kind of also changed the structure of the lighthouse keepers themselves. So, like you said earlier, at first it was more retired military personnel. But then once the lighthouse service took over, it was kind of more of individuals. And that's where we get a lot of the really cool, in my opinion, the really cool lighthouse stories because it was individuals who came and they brought their families. So during that time period before the Coast Guard took over, what was life like with the lighthouse keepers here?
Oh, so you'd have lighthouse keepers and their assistants, basically. And this continued actually into like the US Lighthouse Service. It depended on location. So they did not want, for many reasons, did not want families living 5 miles from civilization out in the middle of the water. But in the Chesapeake Bay, a lot of these locations, such as Drum Point, were only 2 miles from the nearest town. And so many of the early keepers at Drum Point Lighthouse had families with them. So we've restored our lighthouse to like the 1910 period. And the family that was there were the Weems family. James Locke Weems and his wife, Maria. They had 5 children at first that they moved to the lighthouse with. And then in 1906, their granddaughter was born in the lighthouse, Anna. And Anna is the reason why we were able to sort of pinpoint that time and recreate it because she had the memories, the photographs, everything that was needed to do that. And because when we got the lighthouse in 1975, it had no furniture, as we discussed. It was just a husk.
And she did come with some. Like I said, there's not a lot of original artifacts because that's just the nature of the beast. But she was actually able to bring some of her grandparents' artifacts.
Absolutely. And then there are also some local families who were keepers who are still here. So the Yatemans were the next family after the Weemses. And there's a model of a Chesapeake Bay log canoe, which is a style of sailing boat that is in the lighthouse that was made by that keeper for his 5 children who played with it under the lighthouse.
So, looking at the design of a cottage-style lighthouse, you can go inside and it is completely decorated as it would have been when Anna was a young grandchild during the 1910s. So, and it's from her memory, and it's really quite accurate for that time period. So, why don't you kind of walk us through the style? What does a cottage-style lighthouse look like on its different floors?
Yeah, so the ground floor of the lighthouse, well, it's not really the ground because it's up in the air, but the first floor. It's 4 rooms, basically, a dining room, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living space. And 3 of them we have furnished pretty accurately for the time. So the dining room has a coal burning stove and a coal closet. It's got a older style sewing machine, like a treadle sewing machine. It has my favorite artifact, which is the US Lighthouse Service Library.
Oh, I love the library boxes. They were my favorite artifact. So first off, how did they get these library boxes?
When they were living on the lighthouses, supplies were delivered by tender ships, and it varied based on their needs. So the more offshore lights had more frequent deliveries, ones like Drum Point, less frequent. It was all fuel, dry goods such as coffee and sugar and
A lot of that was provided by the lighthouse service, right?
yes.
Kind of part of their payment. Here's you're living here and here's your salted pork.
Yeah,
So-
there was basic fuel too, the coal, wood for their kitchen stove, and then kerosene for their light. And that's Drum Point was kerosene and then electricity. That's how it ran. Before 1883 in the 1870s, they made that switch and the lighthouse board. But you could do things like order a case of books from the Lighthouse Service Library. So we have one of these cases just under the window. It's a nice touch. Exercise the brain and the imagination, all of that, which is crucial because lighthouses were isolating. Very, very isolating. So this is probably was a treasured resource for them. And then you finish in a few months and then you send away for another set.
I wanted to pop in here and give you a little more information about these amazing library boxes. So, the Lighthouse Establishment launched their Portable Libraries Initiative in 1876. These libraries were kept in those wooden boxes. They were very durable and they were easily stacked, so they could be stacked multiple high on a tender ship. And each of these boxes could hold between 50 and 60 books. Each library box was numbered. At one point in time, there were about 350 of these boxes in circulation, and each box had a printed listing of all of its contents. And these mini libraries were pretty serious business, as with everything in a lighthouse. They were required to be maintained to very high standards. So each book that was removed from the library box had to be recorded. It had to have the name of the person removing it and the date that it was removed. And every time a lighthouse inspector made his quarterly rounds, he would look in it to check the condition of the box, all of its books, and he closely looked to make sure that everything was in order. And if there were any infractions, they handed out quite a penalty to these lighthouse keepers, anywhere from a fine to replacing the books if they were in poor condition. I have to say, as an avid book reader myself, I get it. So, in these boxes, there were all kinds of books. There were mostly fiction books, but a lot of other genres were included. There were technical books and romance novels, magazines, recipes, hymnals, all kinds. Some examples of these books: Seasons with the Seahorses by James Lamont. It was a thrilling tale of sailing and sporting adventure in the northern seas. Another noteworthy book was My Apingi Kingdom: Life in the Great Sahara and Sketches of the Chase of the Ostrich and Hyena by Paul du Chaillu, which even by today's standards sounds pretty interesting. But when you consider some of these lifeguard keepers and their families, this was probably quite the adventure to read about. So these library boxes, they traveled from station to station all along the coast. And we know all of this information in part by a man named Arnold B. Johnson. He was the chief clerk of the United States Lighthouse Board, and he described these libraries in the February 1885 issue of the Library Journal. Johnson writes, "A library may start from the light station at Eastport, Michigan, and work its way clear round the coast, stopping at every large lighthouse in every Atlantic and Gulf state to the Mexican frontier. Then, after visiting every lighthouse on the lakes, finally makes a tour of the lights on the Pacific coast." Johnson also remarks, "These libraries embarked on journeys around the coast, enriching the lives of lighthouse keepers and their families at every stop." All right, let's get back to Kevin for the next step on our audio adventure, the Drum Point Lighthouse kitchen.
So what's really prominent in the kitchen is one of these rain barrels. The Chesapeake Bay is filled with brackish water, which is great for seafood and not so great for anything else that you would need to use water for. So they collected rainwater, each in these giant barrels that just hook right out into the outside gutter system. And each room on the first floor of the lighthouse has one of these massive, it's really more of a cistern. So with all of those combined, they had plenty of water for washing up dishes. And at that time, rainwater is the freshest water you were ever going to get. Minus, I guess, the seagull droppings that would maybe wash off the roof and into the bottom of the tank. But see, the kitchen also, there's like a pantry filled with dry goods. We don't do too much with the food, though, because based on what Anna told us and, just other evidence from the time period, we know these were incredibly self-sufficient people. They were feeding themselves off of the little bit of property that was attached to the lighthouse during the growing season. And then the rest of the year, oysters, crabs, fish, shrimp, they're just constantly, and a big one was waterfowl, because after eating the ducks, they could use all of the feathers and the down to make pillows, mattresses, jackets, all of that stuff. They were not a people that had access to big box stores, everything aside from maybe a pair of shoes. They would need to make themselves.
They were incredibly resourceful. So the fourth room on this fourth floor is more or less more open. It has a great panel on the side that shares interesting or special events recorded by lighthouse keepers. And there is a closet that has some really heavy weights in it. What are these weights for? There's something of the fog warning system.
That was a fog signal, and the mechanical striker for the bell, which runs off of a counterweight system. So the weights themselves are in a closet on the first floor in the living room. which is pretty nice. There's also a Bell Company telephone, the style that you spoke into the little piece, and there are no phone numbers, so there's no buttons. That's always fun to point out to kids. There's a set of like a dining service for the U.S. Lighthouse Service, which they sometimes gave away as like retirement gifts or like appreciation gifts. There is what the lighthouse was replaced with, which is a solar powered light. And then the panel that shows all the keepers, it does mention some weird things like a keeper that raised beagles in the lighthouse.
I was always curious about that. Like, what are they doing with these beagle droppings? Because every time they needed to like let their dog outside, they would have had to have done it on the deck. I mean, they're not going to take a boat on shore every time they have to go.
That one would be really interesting to see like what the lighthouse inspectors said about that, because I can just, it had to smell atrocious in the lighthouse with all those beagles.
You guys should get a stuffed beagle and put it in the lighthouse as like a nod to the crazy dog guy who is also on that panel that tells you all of the different fun entries on the logs. There are also some weather extremes listed on that log.
There's a entry about 1 February where the bay froze and the lighthouse keepers are still trying to do their job, and they write about how it's so cold that with a fire going in the room, the water on the station froze. And then there's another one that goes from in August where they talk about the thermometer they've got in the lighthouse reading 124 degrees. And then the 1933 hurricane that struck and had a storm surge that almost washed the lighthouse away. We've got just a bunch of different little stories. My favorite is the keeper who was stationed during World War II because they were doing practice maneuvers for what eventually was the D-Day invasion right on the beach outside Drum Point Lighthouse. So we have that story, and then we've got the aerial photograph, because it was a very well photographed war, of one of these transport vessel. It's right there on the beach.
So, how do we know all of this information about the lighthouse keepers?
Oh, so they have very good records in our government, and you can go through Coast Guard and find all of the files because the lighthouse service was absorbed by the Coast Guard. So they have it all there in their archives. There are a number of really, really great volunteer organizations. So we have the Lighthouse Society. So we have a Chesapeake chapter. If you go to their web pages, they've got beautiful compilations of lighthouse records. You can pull up Drum Point Lighthouse and on their website, and they'll show you every keeper who is there, their dates of service, all of the major changes to the light, noteworthy things that happened.
And they kept such good records because they had to. They were required to write in them every day. And if they didn't, when their random inspections would just show up, they could get in trouble if they hadn't been keeping up daily to their standards.
And they're hilarious too, especially from the 19th century, like around the time of the Civil War. A lot of people were like rum runners. Their lighthouse keepers are like facilitating the illegal, I guess, booze trade. And again, during the Prohibition years, it's hilarious. The lighthouse keepers were like, if they weren't involved in it, you had to tip them off.
The intense lighthouse keepers. So there is also a really nice deck on the first floor where they hung the lighthouse boat.
On the davits, that's something we're doing right now. So we have a small craft guild at the museum, and they are building the original, to the original plans, they're building the lighthouse boat.
And also on that railing is a lovely little outhouse that just hangs over the railing. And so you would do your business and it would just drop right down to the water. So that is the first floor. Then you go and you start going up the spiral staircase in the middle, and that takes you to the second floor, technically.
The second floor, like when you step off, is all working space of a lighthouse. It has a mechanical striker for the bell, the specifics on how it worked, a little panel that explains that. There's a story that goes with that. At the close of the 1920s, there was a man and a woman taking care of the lighthouse. And they, due to family tragedy, ended up as the guardians of their niece. And so this 10-year-old girl is at the lighthouse, and she has a friend who's over to visit. And the two adults have left these two girls at the lighthouse. They've gone in to Solomon's. It's about a 2-hour trip in. And this is one of those instances where you just have unexpected weather shifts. Maybe a front was coming through and it created fog. And the girls knew they had to run the bell to warn the mariners. So they're really bright kids. They knew what they had to do. They just couldn't get the machine to work. It's very simple mechanics, but for these two 10-year-olds, they couldn't figure out how to start it. And so they took turns manually ringing the bell until the adults were able to make it back. If you look at this machine, the chain that runs and the weights are suspended from it, it's like a bike chain, and we all know what happens with bike chains. They slip, and so if that happens, one person on your team has to fix that while the other person is manually striking the bell.
One thing I do want to make sure that I mention, it's my favorite thing about the bells, and it's such an ingenious design. So every single lighthouse had a different system of their bells ringing, like a different pattern. So if you were at Drum Point Lighthouse and it was foggy, you couldn't see anything, but you could still hear, it's like 2 rings every 15 seconds. And that was the pattern for that lighthouse. So if you heard that, then you knew that you were at the Drum Point Lighthouse. However, if it was something, like 1 bell every 7 seconds, then, it was a different lighthouse. And that is so smart. What a genius way to do it.
And all of your navigational charts would have this information, by the way. So they would have the sound signatures. They would have the light characteristic. So if it flashed, it would tell you how often it flashed. And then the other part, which we didn't mention, is the day marks of the lighthouse, which is how they're painted and designed. So Drum Point it's a screw pile lighthouse. It's a cottage screw pile, so it looks like a little house, but it's a hexagon-shaped house. It's got white walls and a red roof and a black cupola on the top, green shutters. No other screw pile on the Chesapeake Bay could have all of those elements, so that on a clear day, the ship captain can just look and see, okay, hexagon, screw pile, green shutters, it's Drum Point. And that's the reason why, everyone who has their coastal lighthouses, some of them have diamonds, some of them have stripes, some of them are red and white, black and white. That's the same reason. Day marks.
So, as an audio production, I simply could not let you continue this audio journey without listening to the actual fog bell of the Drum Point Lighthouse. Kevin went on a one-man mission to find the audio in the archive just for us. It was on a cassette tape, but we were able to get it as an audio file, and as a very special treat, I have it here for you to listen to. You will hear some heavy clunking right before the bell, and that's the striker mechanism cranking back the striker and letting it loose. Here it is. What you just heard is exactly what mariners navigating the Chesapeake Bay in foggy weather would have heard. 2 bell strikes over 15 seconds. Okay, back to Kevin and the mechanical striker on the second floor.
So we have that, and it's right in the middle of the room. It's a huge feature. But then across from it is this simple table. It's a little metal tray that's extended from the wall. It has a kerosene can on it and a kerosene lamp. And that is where they filled all of their lamps. Lighthouses were made out of wood mostly. You're using kerosene as your light source. It's a huge fire hazard. So they had this station to do the lamps. And we talked about the inspectors coming just out of the blue. This is one thing they were looking for. If they came through and it looked like you had been keeping up with your maintenance, the lens is beautiful, it's polished to you could see a reflection in it. There are no areas where it needs to be painted. They've taken care of all of that. This looks good, but then they go through the dining room and see a stack of lamps, like where the wicks are being trimmed or something. Well, they're going to get a huge demerit for that because It's a fire hazard.
And it all had to be done on that little metal shelf because it had the little lip around it to catch.
Yeah, to catch all of that and to catch the oil, or kerosene rather. So we have that side, and then just opposite is a watchroom. So it's where the person with the duty of taking care of the light would sleep for the night. And lighthouse keepers did not sleep like we do. They're not, oh, I got my 8 hours. They could get 8 hours, but it was in chunks. So they would set alarms, and basically every 2 hours they had to get up and make sure everything was still running smoothly, because the reason why they're there is to provide a steady, unwavering navigational aid. And that's not going to be the case if the lamp burns out in the middle of the night. And if you think about it, it's a lot like these people had newborns that never matured. They never grew up. So it's like all night long, they're just getting up, getting up, getting up.
So then you go up to the third and final floor. It's not really much of a floor. It's kind of just a tiny platform.
That's where you have the fourth order Fresnelons, the red panels, so you can see all of the graffiti on the walls from those teenagers, a hatch to access the outer decks. And while you're standing on that level, looking out of the windows at this beautiful view, you'll notice that the stovepipe is ridiculously tall. It extends up over the roof of the lighthouse by like 15 feet. And that is so the smoke from the stoves did not interfere with the light signal.
So, can you tell us a typical day of a lighthouse keeper?
Sure. So it would start early in the morning with extinguishing the light. At sunrise, the light would be extinguished. Many of these lights would have curtains in the lantern room that they would then shut for the day. Then the keeper would spend most of the rest of the morning polishing the lens. Hours and hours of meticulous polishing with linen cloths, because they don't leave lint behind. They would polish all the brass and crystal, and this would take them probably till noon, lunchtime. Then they might come down, make some notes in the logbook about the weather, do painting projects. So maybe the shutters get painted one week and then the siding gets painted the next. The Chesapeake Bay has got lots of salt in the water, going to corrode everything. So it's constant maintenance. They might then take the boat into Solomon's to get their mail, which was their favorite thing to do. Get supplies. They usually did that twice a week. So they'd set aside 2 weeks for that. If it was the growing season, they would be tending to corn, tomatoes, those types of things that they were growing on shore. They might send somebody for water. They had a pump well, so they might get some drinking water to bring back.
And wouldn't they also sometimes have, like, not huge livestock, but they would have chickens on shore or.
Yeah, and some of the offshore lights actually kept the chickens and pigs even
Oh, wow.
on the storage platform,
Really?
just penned up so they could use them. They also probably did some fishing, duck hunting, and then you're getting to the close of the day. In the winter season, they would start eating dinner very early, maybe 3:30 in the afternoon, because at 4 o'clock, there's no light left. This is something we take for granted, just all of the light sources we have around. So if you can imagine being out on the Chesapeake Bay, and you're really just getting moonlight and star, it's gonna be inky blackness. So they would end their day really early. And as soon as the sun set, the light needed to be on, and then they started those 2-hour watches.
Yeah, and with the lighthouse keepers, there would be one main keeper, but then there'd also be an assistant, a lighthouse assistant. And so you did have help doing these activities because the lighthouse always had to be manned by somebody. If there wasn't a lighthouse assistant, though, then the wife would often act as the lighthouse assistant, an unpaid one, I might add. And that's how they preferred it because then they didn't have to pay anyone to be a lighthouse assistant. But then you're thinking taking care of the kids if you had a family. So if you had a literate wife, then she could be the one to homeschool them. If not, then they would go to school on shore. Actually, the building that is the administrative building at the Marine Museum is one of those old schools that the students would go to. They sometimes even had a school boat instead of a school bus that would pick the kids up. but you're still talking about feeding everyone. You're talking about doing all the laundry. I mean, and like you said, they had to be very self-sufficient. They're canning fruits and veggies and cooking. Cooking in itself just takes forever. So they're doing regular living, but it's different because it's living on a lighthouse. So you're doing lighthouse living and lighthouse duties.
And some of these assistant keepers who were the keepers' wives, there was one in the 30s who was much better at managing the radio than her husband was. So she was doing all of the radio communications. We have one we know about who was a much stronger swimmer than her husband. And on the Chesapeake Bay lighthouses, they had to do rescues. So she was the rescue swimmer for every single time they had to go and rescue some unfortunate fools out in the Chesapeake Bay.
Usually drunken sailors.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So everyone's got a lot of tasks to do. But then there's downtime too, which they're gonna crack into that library, or they're gonna invite the local watermen over for a game of cards. And most of the lighthouse keepers were beloved by the local watermen who saw them every day, often stopped in to chat. On their breaks, they would give them gifts of fish, crabs, all of that.
And just like today, it's a novelty. People wanted to come and visit and spend the night in a lighthouse.
Absolutely, especially if it's a nice day. They could sit on the lower decks or out and you're just surrounded by the water and the breeze.
Yeah, the lighthouse is pretty awesome. And the museum is as well. So the museum covers a lot.
We have got the maritime history of the area, which covers Southern Maryland, the War of 1812, during World War II, the native peoples of the Patuxent, which are going to be the Piscataway people. We've got the whole history of the steamboats and the oyster canneries that were in the area, shipbuilding. But then we also have a full aquarium covering the life that is in the Chesapeake Bay estuary. We have a huge section for paleontology because one of our geological features is the Calvert Cliffs, which has probably the best, most complete fossil beds for the Miocene in North America. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. People see it and they think, oh, we can do this in 45 minutes. And then 2 hours later, they're like, oh, we have to come back.
The museum really is a little gem because I feel like it's not super well known, but anyone who has been here is like this is the place to be. And I was lucky enough to actually work here with all of these amazing landmarks.
So we actually have 3 or 4 historic landmarks, 2 lighthouses, the oyster cannery, and then the longest running passenger vessel in the Chesapeake Bay, which is called the William B. Tennyson, which is a converted bug-eye.
It's an amazing vessel, and they used to have a first mate aboard the vessel who would give you a tour like you would not believe. And they just can't seem to get rid of her. She just keeps coming back. But Kevin, thank you so much for sharing this museum. And I just like seeing you in general. And this was a great excuse.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Curator's Choice, a Mighty Oak Media production. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and rating the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you love a museum and would like to hear it featured in an episode, shoot me a message at curatorschoicepodcast@gmail.com. I'll do my best to reach out and see if I can get them to be on the show. You can also view articles, artifacts, and more by following us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for listening to Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers.